Is buying a home really better than renting, especially in expensive cities like Vancouver or Toronto, where affordability feels out of reach? You've probably seen advice online claiming that renting is the smarter move, but is that actually true? Today, I'm breaking it down with real numbers to see which option comes out on top. Along the way, I'll cover the biggest misconceptions about rent versus buy debate, show you why simple comparisons like rent versus mortgage don't tell the full story, and highlight the hidden costs you need to factor in. The results might surprise you, so let's get right into it. Common misconception. A lot of people assume that if your mortgage payment is the same as or even lower than your rent, buying must be the smarter choice. But that's actually an oversimplification. The reality is that the costs of home ownership and renting are very different. And to make a fair comparison, you need to look at all the unrecoverable costs. So what do I mean by unrecoverable? It's the money that you'll never see back. With renting, it's pretty straightforward. Your rent is gone the moment you pay it. With buying, it's a bit more complicated because not all of your monthly mortgage payment is lost. Here's why. When you make a mortgage payment, part of it goes to interest and part of it goes to principal. The interest portion is unrecoverable. It's a cost of borrowing money from the bank. But the principal is different. That's money that you're effectively paying yourself. Because when you sell your home at or above the purchase price, that equity comes back to you. Keep in mind that if you happen to sell your home at below your purchase price, then you'll be underwater. So it's important to do your research and make a fair offer when you first purchase your place, not just overbid simply to get the home. But the unrecoverable costs don't stop there. With home ownership, you also take on property transfer tax, annual property taxes, strata or HOA fees, home insurance, and etc., none of which you get back. And here's a piece that a lot of people forget: opportunity cost. When you buy a home, you're tying up your down payment. That's money that you could have invested somewhere else, like the stock market. Choosing real estate means you're giving up potential returns from other investments, and that's an opportunity cost that you need to factor in. So instead of comparing the rent versus just the mortgage payment, the smart approach is to weigh all these unrecoverable costs side by side: rent, interest, taxes and fees, as well as opportunity costs. To bring this to life, let's walk through some numbers. Imagine that you're looking at a condo priced at $600,000. That gets you a one bedroom in downtown Vancouver. Let's say property taxes are about $2,262 per year and strata fees are $404 per month. With an average 4% mortgage rate on a 5-year fixed, your mortgage is calculated to be $2,525. Now compare that to renting a similar type of unit in the same building, going for roughly $2,850 per month. On the surface, the mortgage payment might look cheaper, but once you factor in interest, fees, and taxes, the picture completely changes. And what about appreciation? Canada's housing market has been volatile, with prices surging one year and dropping in others, like what we are experiencing now. For the sake of today's calculation, let's use a modest 3% average appreciation going forward. On the other hand, the S&P 500 has averaged approximately 10% annually. For our calculations, let's assume after-tax returns of 7%. We'll be going over two scenarios. Scenario 1 is renting versus buying in the first year, and scenario 2 is renting versus buying after 5 years. So let's jump right into the calculation. Welcome to the tutorial portion of this video where we will be comparing the cost of buying a home versus renting a home. Just some housekeeping here. I just want to make sure that, if you have access to this template, all you have to do is go to File, and you could download an Excel version, or you could simply just make a copy and you will have access to this Google Sheets template as well. And if you want access to this template, make sure to check out the description box down below. So with all the housekeeping over, let's move forward with the assumptions part of this calculation. Assumptions are very, very important as it will impact the final result. And so something that I like to highly emphasize is to play around with different numbers and do a scenario analysis. The numbers that will be used here are specifically for this situation, but it will be completely different depending on your situation. So feel free to play around with the numbers. I'll be going over the assumptions used in this particular home. So with the home that we're looking at, it is going to be a downtown apartment in Vancouver. And this is the listing that I came across. As you can see, it's your standard one bedroom apartment in downtown Vancouver. So when we look at the details of the home, we can see that it's a one bedroom, one bathroom, around 684 square feet, so within what we're looking for in terms of size, and it's located in downtown Vancouver. It's in the heart of Yaletown to be exact. And so with these details, let's look at what the monthly rent is. So if we're just to quickly skip over to what the rental price is, you can see that the address 1155 Homer Street, which is exactly the same as this address, which is on sale. But the units are different, so the size is also slightly different. I believe this is a little bit smaller, 670 square feet, but we'll still use this for comparison purposes. So with this apartment, you can see that the monthly rent, it's going for $2,850. And so that is where I'm getting this number from. In terms of renter's insurance, this is a little bit lower than if you were to be a homeowner. Based on my research, it's about $30 per month. And so that is the number I put down here. And so that is going to be your total monthly cost. Keep in mind that this excludes common costs such as Wi-Fi, hydro, because those are costs that will be incurred whether you're renting or whether you're buying. Now to move on to buying, so going back to this listing here, you can see with this particular home, the price is $599,000. I've rounded it up to $600,000 just to keep things simple. And then when it comes to property transfer tax, so this is going to be a one-time cost that you're paying when you first purchase a home. Now, if you are a first-time home buyer, you might be exempt from this depending on the price of the home that you're purchasing. For the sake of this example, we're going to say that you are not a first-time home buyer or you're not eligible for it. So we've calculated this to be $10,000. And for more details on how it was calculated, we'll be going over that later in this video. But just to kind of move things along, let's put down $10,000 when you first purchase that home. And in BC, that is termed a property transfer tax. Now, when you buy a home, you also need to put down a deposit. Now, if you put down under 20%, then you would have to pay an extra cost called mortgage insurance, which is added to your existing mortgage. And so this becomes a bit more costly. I'll also go over an example of this later in the video, but in our example, since we're putting down 20%, we'll say there is no mortgage insurance. With the 5-year fixed rate, we are going with 4%. This is just an estimate I put down based on the current market. It seems like you could get something from 4.14%. There's even advertisements of 3.89%. So I just got the average and, used a round number like 4% for simplicity's sake. Now, in Canada, it's standard to go with a 25% amortization period, which is the time that it takes to pay off your mortgage. And so that is where the 25 is coming from. If you're able to get a longer amortization period, like 30 years, feel free to update it. And something I forgot to mention is everything in green is something that you would need to update, and the cells in gray are automatically being updated. So make sure that you go through all the green cells to update it to your specific situation. Now, going back to the specifics of the property that we're looking at, and in this listing, you could see those costs. So for example, when you look at the property tax, the annual amount is $2,262. So that is what we put down here. Make sure that you keep track of whether costs are annual or monthly. So in this case, it's going to be an annual cost. For strata fees, this is going to be a monthly cost, as you can see here, $404. So that's what we've put down here. Now for home insurance and miscellaneous maintenance, these are more estimates because we don't know how much they will cost. But for home insurance for owners, they are usually around $80 to $100. So I put down $80 for now. And for miscellaneous maintenance costs, I put down $0. But for miscellaneous maintenance costs, if you are aware of certain costs that you will be paying every single month, feel free to put them down here. There's a space for you to put down additional costs that are not covered in this calculation, so it provides a bit more flexibility. So when it comes to total monthly cost to buy, that would be your total. We also need to take into consideration selling costs later down the road to see whether it really makes sense to buy versus rent over a period of time. So with the selling price, this is automated. This is being drawn for somewhere else, which I'll go into more details later in this video. And for realtor fees, this is a selling cost that you need to pay as a seller on behalf of both the seller and the buyer. So as a buyer, you don't need to be responsible for it here in BC in particular. I don't know how it works for other provinces or other states, but for BC, usually the realtor fees are paid by the seller. So if you plan to sell it later down the road, it is quite a hefty fee. For the realtor commission, I just used a calculator that I found online. It might not be exact, but it'll give you a good estimate. So you could just put in the inputs like, let's say 695, $695, 564. Choose commission type, typical Vancouver, yes, relocating, undecided. And if you calculate, you could see that it comes out with $24,516, which is the amount that we have here. And you can see that it's broken down between the buying agent commission and the selling agent commission and any sales tax that is added on top of it. So that is going to be the selling costs. Now, this is just giving you a quick picture in terms of the cash flow when it comes to rent versus buy. It doesn't tell you the full story when it comes to how much of the costs when it relates to buying a home is actually related to recoverable versus unrecoverable, but I thought it will just be useful just for additional information if you like. In this case, the cost to buy on a monthly basis has a higher cash flow than to rent by about $318. Like I said, this doesn't tell the full story, and we'll break down why later in this video. And then lastly here, we're also going to be looking at opportunity costs. And in order to calculate opportunity costs, we need to look at a certain rate of return. So for real estate, the annual, I put down 3%. In Vancouver, it's been pretty volatile, where in certain years it's like double digits, and other years it's a little bit slow. Like currently the real estate market is a bit slow, but for our calculation purposes, let's just put down 3%. Feel free to change it if you like. For the stock market annual return, I put down 7%. I think the S&P 500 averaged around 10% before tax. So, taking into consideration, let's say it's about 7% on average. Feel free to adjust this if you like, with a rate that is more applicable to you. And lastly, we're also taking into consideration inflation. So we put an average of 2% per year. This can be on the lower end. If you like to put it higher, you could do that as well. So these are just estimates. Feel free to play around with the numbers. Now, something to consider is that when you're talking about opportunity cost for real estate, it's based on the total value of the purchase price. So $600,000, even if that amount is not fully paid off because you do have a mortgage, you'll still get a return on the full purchase price. Whereas for the stock market, it will only be based on the deposit, the cash that you have on hand. So that is going to be the deposit amount of $120,000. So that's all our assumptions. Now let's move on to our calculations. So jumping into the scenario analysis, we have two scenarios which we will be doing the calculations for. Scenario 1 are all the costs after 1 year, and scenario 2 are all the costs after 5 years. So when we start with scenario 1, we'll start with rent. It's pretty straightforward. It's basically pulling the monthly rent amount times 12, same with renter's insurance. Now, moving on to buy, this is where it gets a bit more complicated. We'll first cover the mortgage payments, and there are two components, which are the principal payments and the interest payments, which make up the total of $30,302. If you want to know how these amounts are calculated, you can go to the mortgage amortization schedule, and it'll show you the breakdown over here. So these are all cells that are being pulled from the assumptions. Everything here is being automated, and you can see that when you take on a mortgage of $480,000, your total payments are actually $761,887, in which you're paying $281,887 as interest over the lifetime of the mortgage. And of course, you're paying back the $480,000 as well. So this kind of gives you more insight into how your mortgage works. You could also see that the total monthly payments of $2,525 and how it gets broken down between the interest and the principal over here. And so when you add up all the interest payments, that would be the total $18,994, which is being pulled over here for interest. And then the principal is a little bit lower. As you can see here, over time, the amount that you're putting towards principal increases as you pay down your mortgage. Now, moving on to other costs that come with home ownership, there's property tax, which you pay annually. There's strata fees, there is home insurance, there may be also other miscellaneous maintenance. I'll put down 0 for now, but feel free to put in an amount that you feel is appropriate just to add some buffer to the calculations. When it comes to total annual home ownership costs, that's $8,070. Now, costs that take most homeowners by surprise are the big one-time costs. So when you first buy a home, there's something called a property transfer tax that you need to pay in BC, and that is $10,000 on a home that costs $600,000. So I put that down. And if you are curious with how this is calculated, I will be be going into a bit more detail with the big one-time costs that you should consider and how they are calculated. So make sure that you watch until the end of the video. When it comes to realtor commission, this is paid when you sell the home. And usually in BC, when you are the seller, you pay both the buyer and the seller's commission. And so that is a big amount when it comes to selling your home. And that cost is estimated to be $22,344. And when we go back to the calculation over here, I've actually updated the cells to indicate the selling price after 1 year and then the selling price after 5 years, taking into consideration the real estate appreciation rate. So the selling cost will be slightly different. Doesn't make a huge difference, but I just wanted to add that additional detail. So this section was updated. Now moving on to costs that are not directly related to cash flow per se on a monthly basis, but should still be taken into account when making the investment. So if you were to invest your deposit, the $120,000 into the stock market, you'll expect a return of $8,400 over the course of the year. Now, taking into consideration appreciation on real estate at 3% on $600,000, that appreciation amount is about $18,000. So when looking at just these two amounts alone, the return on the real estate is greater than the return on the stock market, just because you have leverage where this amount is being applied on the full $600,000 and this amount is being applied on the deposit amount of $120,000. Now, for these next two amounts, take it as you will. I've just included them for completeness purposes, but basically this one is the return on investment for principal payments. And I've added the calculations over here. And it basically means if you were to invest the amount that you're paying towards the stock market instead, how much of a return you're able to get. Now, of course, you need to take into consideration the difference of the interest rate per month on the mortgage and then the return on the stock market. So the difference here is about 0.25% per month. And for each month, you can see that it's greater than the last month just because you had more time to compound the returns of that principal payment over the course of a year. And conversely, if you look at the last month, you only had 1 month to invest in it, hence the lower returns. But if you add everything up, it's very nominal. It's only $184. Now, the last one is a return on investment of the rent less the mortgage interest. That is also illustrated over here. Is basically taking the difference between the rent, which is $2,850, and the interest on the mortgage, which is $1,600. And that difference is $1,250 for the first month. So if you were to invest that difference into the stock market over here of 0.58% per month, you will have $9.36 in the first month just because it had more time to compound, and then the last month would be more nominal returns. So that's how this calculation is made. Now, if you feel like that is a little bit overboard, feel free to delete it and remove it from your calculations. I just added it for completeness purposes. So all in all, if you add up all the opportunity costs, it's actually $10,000 in your favor when it comes to real estate. And when we look at the outcome, I've split it into 3 different sections. The first is pure cash outflow. So when we're just looking at cash outflow, when it comes to rent, super simple across all 3 scenarios, it's going to be $34,560. Now, when it comes to home ownership, the first cash outflow is going to be the total mortgage payments plus the annual home ownership costs, and then the property transfer tax, the realtor commission, and that's going to be it because those are the known cash payments that need to be made. Now, when it comes to total unrecoverable costs, that's only taking into consideration the unrecoverable portion of your mortgage, not the $30,000, but the $18,994, and then all the other payments stay the same. And that reduces your total cost of home ownership to $59,408. And then the last scenario is taking the total unrecoverable costs plus the opportunity cost, so the $10,002, which is in favor for real estate. And in that case, the total cost is $49,406. And you can see that in all 3 scenarios, it doesn't make sense to own a home for a year. The renting is the way to go, and you can see the cost difference across the 3 different outcomes. Now, moving on to scenario 2, this is going to be rent versus buy over 5 years. In this case, I've applied the inflation of 2% per year, as well as for the renter's insurance, and that's over a 5-year period. The total cost is $179,852. And then when it comes to buying, you can see that the total mortgage is $151,512. You can see the breakdown over here when you add everything up
over the 5-year period. And in this case, the total mortgage payment is $151,512, in which $61,340 is going towards your principal, so that's a recoverable, and then $9,172 goes towards the interest portion, so that's unrecoverable. Similarly, for all these annual home ownership costs, the 2% inflation has also been applied, and that comes to a total of $42,000 around. The property transfer tax that was paid upon buying the home, so that stays the same. And then for the realtor commission fee, that's a little bit higher at $24,516. I'll also show you how I calculated this later in the video. And when it comes to the return on investment, you can see that it's a lot greater over the 5-year period. And this is taking into consideration compounding on a monthly basis. So for investment in the stock market, that's $48,306. When it comes to return on investment on real estate, that's a lot greater at $95,564. This is compounded on an annual basis. And then there is the return on investment for the principal payments, and then the return on investment of the rent less mortgage interest. And you can see that while these amounts were pretty nominal here, these amounts are more significant after 5 years. And if you want to see more details on how this is calculated, you could go back to the mortgage amortization schedule and you can check out how it's calculated under the 5th year column over here. And all in all, when you take into consideration for rent over 5 years, that's $179,852 of just pure cash outflow. And it actually stays the same across all 3 results. And when it comes to buying, it differs drastically. So when it comes to pure cash outflow, so you're taking into consideration total mortgage payment, the total annual home ownership costs, the property transfer tax, and then the realtor commissions, that total comes to $228,000. So it's far greater than renting by $48,000. However, this is where things differ a little bit because part of your mortgage payment actually went towards principal. And so that is the recoverable portion. And if you consider only the unrecoverable component, then it drastically decreases the cost. So, and in that case, it's $166,685. And in this case, it is lower than renting by $13,167. And if you are to take it one step further and we add up the opportunity cost, and that adds up to a total cost, which nets the return on the real estate, it comes to $107,615, and the difference there is staggering by $72,236. So it's important to look at this from all 3 perspectives because at the end of the day, this is a cash that you need to be willing to pay. And when you end up selling your home, you will have a much greater return just because you were able to stick it through the 5 years.
In our example, buying makes sense if you plan to stay for the long haul of 5 years or more, but not if it's just for a short period like 1 year. That's because home ownership comes with large one-time costs such as property transfer tax and realtor commissions, which only make financial sense when you spread them out over several years. The results can vary widely depending on the assumptions that you plug in, such as your home price, your down payment, your mortgage rates, the stock market returns, and rent increase. They all play a role. That's why running the numbers for your situation is so important. I suggest playing around with the numbers and having room for error on any of these factors to see how it can affect your finances. This way, you can make the best decision for you and be prepared for unexpected changes in life. Don't forget the other considerations. There are several other costs of home ownership that we briefly covered in our calculations, and I want to cover them in a bit more detail just to illustrate large costs that often take homeowners by surprise. It's important to research any additional costs that might apply specifically to the province or state that you live in. If we use British Columbia, Canada as an example, here are some major one-time costs to keep in mind when buying real estate. Property transfer tax, PTT. In BC, the property transfer tax, or PTT for short, ranges from 1 to 3% of the home's purchase price. If you are a first-time home buyer purchasing a home valued at $500,000 or less, you may qualify for a full exemption, which can save you roughly $8,000 in PTT. That said, most homes in Vancouver are priced well above $500,000, and in those cases, you may still qualify for a partial exemption. If you're a first-time home buyer, make sure that you're taking taking advantage of all the benefits available to you, so I summarized them in a video linked over here. In our example, we assume no exemption applies. So for a purchase price of $600,000, the property transfer tax would be $10,000. Mortgage loan insurance. This applies if your down payment is less than 20% of the home's purchase price. For instance, if you're buying a $600,000 home and you're putting down only 10%, which is $60,000, your mortgage insurance premium would be $16,740, which is added to your mortgage balance. To avoid paying this insurance, you need a 20% down payment, which we did in our example by putting down a deposit of $120,000 on a purchase price of $600,000. Realtor fees. Realtor commissions come into play when you eventually sell the property. In BC, it's typical for the seller to cover both the buyer's and seller's agent fees. So if you sell your home for $695,564 after 5 years, you could expect to pay roughly $24,516 in total realtor commissions. Non-monetary considerations. There are also lifestyle and personal factors that go beyond just numbers. Commitment versus flexibility. Home ownership ties you to one place, whereas renting allows you to relocate more easily when your lease ends. Stability and control. Owning provides stability and freedom to renovate, decorate, or upgrade your space however you like, something that you can't do when renting. There's also financial risk. A significant portion of your net worth could end up tied to one asset class. Be mentally and financially prepared for potential market corrections and unexpected costs, such as a new roof or a special levy from your strata. That said, paying off your mortgage over time brings you closer to owning your home outright, which reduces long-term housing costs and offers peace of mind. So is buying really better than renting? The answer depends on more than just your monthly payment. The smarter way is to compare the full picture of unrecoverable costs, investment opportunities, and lifestyle trade-offs, and then decide which path fits your goals. If there are any other considerations I missed, make sure to comment down below. And if you want to have access to the template used today, make sure to check out the description box down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye!